Not long ago, one of my instructors in seminary was trying to explain to us a theology he called non-theistic, liberative, naturalistic humanism. I'm still not sure I completely understand it, but it does make for a great vocal warm-up. Before giving any talk or sermon, I just say non-theistic, liberative, naturalistic humanism 3 or 4 times very quickly, and then anything else comes trippingly off the tongue, as we say. Now, I think he was engaging in a bit of seminary professor witticism when he bound all those words and concepts together. But he got quite serious when he explained that this theology expresses the idea that oppression and human suffering, natural disasters and disease, imperialism and war, just the vagaries of the human condition are so random and so dire that we can't realistically believe that there is a God, much less a kind and loving God. On top of that, according to this theology, our struggles to end oppression occur within a sort of zero-sum game, where advances attained by one group can only be made at the expense of greater oppression of another. Justice for all can never be realized. Thus, a central tenet of this theology is that we should abandon hope and embrace struggle, because the struggle is all we really have. And have a nice day. I ended the class discussion feeling something less than uplifted. Later, I talked with my partner Wayne about it. He said, I don't think you should try preaching that when you get out of seminary and start the search process for a church. None of them will call you. So I think Wayne was absolutely right about that. So don't worry, I'm not testing out an abandon all hope ye who enter here sermon on you this morning. But it did get me thinking about that little 4-letter word called hope. What exactly is hope, really? Should we have hope? What is its source, and how do we sustain it, especially during the more difficult times of struggle that we do encounter in life? How do we keep it from becoming just wishful thinking? And so I went on a theological search, a metaphysical quest to find the meaning and source of hope. Like any good modern-day spiritual seeker, I did a Google search. The first link I followed was to the Emily Dickinson poem titled, "Hope is the Thing with Feathers." The next thing I saw was a link to where I could buy a book by Woody Allen called Without Feathers, and so I found myself right back where I had started. Thanks a lot, Woody. So Google as a pathway into spiritual enlightenment having failed me, I turned to looking at what some of our leading thinkers among Unitarian Universalists have had to say about hope. I know those of you that have been UU for a while may not be overly surprised to hear that Unitarian Universalists have had quite a lot to say about it, rather often not agreeing with each other on the subject. I did find, though, much that moved me in reflections on faith and hope from Rebecca Ann Parker, president of our Unitarian Universalist Seminary in Berkeley, California, as well as those of Sharon Welch, provost of the seminary I attend in Chicago. The two have very different philosophical and theological perspectives, and yet from both of them I drew that indeed we must start by embracing the struggle, that hope is found by realistically acknowledging that suffering and oppression are a part of life, but then seeking to transcend them in several ways. First, by steadfastly continuing to act in ways that are loving and life-giving. Second, by persistently seeking and demanding justice. And finally, by purposefully finding the wisdom we need to sustain ourselves in the voices of those who have suffered oppression. These are people who have so often found ways to restore hope out of hopelessness by creating joy, grace, and beauty in day-to-day life. I think, though, we also have to guard against a kind of false hope, a hope that can lead to disillusionment and making harmful choices, that seeks certainty, wherein we only have faith if we believe that we can control the outcome of our actions. I think of the challenge we face with global climate change when I think about this. The fact that even if we were to begin now to try to mitigate the changes that are going to occur, it's likely to get much worse before it gets better. Given that, how do we hold on to a hope that can sustain environmental action? Where do we find the resilience to continue to act even knowing that we may not be able to prevent great loss? Well, the answer may lie in embracing this paradox. Faith can only exist when there is uncertainty. Hope often arises out of what we cannot know, out of our choosing to act through love for each other and the web of existence, even in the midst of our not knowing, even when we encounter great challenges. I saw this element of hope, this faith, even in the face of an uncertain future, a future clouded by unexpected loss and grief, when I served as a chaplain at a local hospital. I'm going to change the details a little to protect the privacy of those involved, but here is in essence what happened. I was with the husband and the father of a woman in her early 40s who had collapsed near the end of the workday. Despite valiant efforts to revive her, she died in one of the trauma rooms in the emergency center. We later learned that a blood clot had loosened and traveled through her blood system to her heart, likely the result of a long flight she had taken to visit her sisters in South America. Her husband and her father were at her bedside, mourning over her now lifeless body. The family was Catholic and spoke both Spanish and English, so they asked me to contact their priest to come and say prayers and perform the sacraments in Spanish. They wanted me to stay with them as the rest of the family gathered and they waited on the priest. Soon after, her daughter and son arrived, both of whom looked like they might be in their late 20s or even in their teens, followed by other family members. All that I could really do was to be with them, put a comforting hand on a shoulder at times, provide a soothing voice at others, just to at times stand in the doorway trying to provide them sanctuary from the noise and commotion of the emergency center. After the priest came and performed the sacraments and said a final prayer, I turned to walk him out when suddenly her husband looked up at me from where he was sitting by her bedside and said, "Would you stay with us while we tell her goodbye?" I hadn't even known he knew that I was still in the room. I stayed. They gathered round her, this daughter, this wife, this mother of theirs. They began to tell stories of her, blending laughter with tears as they joined together in their love for one another and their love for her, as they one by one said goodbye to her. The amazing love, the astounding human resilience, the astonishing courage they showed in being able to tell her goodbye, leave that hospital, and move forward into an uncertain future bound tightly in their love for one another and their shared memories of her. Sometimes that is faith. Sometimes that's hope. Sometimes hope is finding a way to continue our stories even up against a struggle that turns toward the tragic at times. Hope is to be found in the fact that we carry forward the stories of even those we have lost, just as the story of that mother, wife, and daughter goes on through her family's telling and continuing the telling of it. Hope is that a grand narrative is still unfolding and we get to participate in the telling of it, even if in only small ways. And I think that hope involves even a bit more. I think it also compels us to move toward a vision of the future, even though we can't control and may not even ever know what happens in that future. I think about something my grandfather did when I reflect on this aspect of hope. My parents divorced when I was young, so my mom's parents helped raise me and my little brother and sister while Mom was at work. My grandfather, Leo, became very much a father figure for me. I still carry great love for him. He was a person who loved largely, embracing with true warmth and great compassion everyone he met. I love that he would go from hyperkinetic in one moment to having this amazing stillness in the next. I love that he also had a strong vision for living and doing rightly in the world. In fact, the family always joked about how he could be a little irritating because he wouldn't hesitate to tell you when he thought you could be doing something better in life. That wasn't the really irritating part, though. The really annoying thing was that he was almost always right. My family still pokes fun at me because they say I'm so much like him, though I suspect not nearly as often right. Whether through nature or nurture or both, I owe much of who I have become to him. Another way of saying that is to say that many of his values and much of what mattered most to him live on in me. And I think there's a lot of hope to be found just in that. I'll give you an idea how much of who I am comes from my grandfather by telling you what happened the first time I brought my partner Wayne to meet my grandparents. I must have been in my 30s at the time. We drove over to their house, sat in the living room talking for several hours, my grandmother treating us to these delicious baked items from her kitchen. Grandma eventually had to take us all around their yard and show us her beautiful flowering plants, and grandfather had to get out his maps and show us all the places they were going on their next trip, something I find myself subjecting others to even today. After the visit, we said our goodbyes and got in the car to leave. I noticed that Wayne had this perplexed, bewildered look on his face. I looked at him and I asked, "What is it?" He paused for about half a second and then said, "I feel like I just met an 80-year-old you." To this day, he still tells me I'm pulling a Leo from time to time. After my grandfather died, we opened his safe where he kept his important papers. In it, we found letters he had written to my grandmother and their children, my mom and her brother and sister. In the letters, he spoke of his love for them, the joy they had brought to his life, his delight in who they had become and how they were living their lives. He wrote of his love for his grandchildren and his faith in the lives we would live. He thanked my grandmother for their life together. Even all these years later, I still get overwhelmed by the fact that he even thought to do that. How much love can one heart possibly hold? How can we call this anything else but hope, grounded in boundless and endless love? Hope is writing letters to the future, even though it's a future that will not include us, at least not in our current form. Hope is writing letters to the future, knowing that we may never know whether or how they will be received, never know what difference they may make. I have to pause here and say, thanks, Leo. Your letters made a huge difference to me. Turns out he was right again, and he taught me something else. The lives we live are our letters to the future. They are our hope for how the story will continue. Isn't it remarkable that hope turns out to be contained within how we live our lives in the here and now? And so, as we leave today and go back out into our daily lives, may we continually be asking ourselves, what story are we helping to write? What are we putting into our letters to the future? Even in the midst of life's struggle and hardships, we can choose to live grounded in love for all that is, all that came before, and all that will follow. The poet Adrian Rich put it like this: "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." And so, may we create hope where hope has been lost. And so, may we dwell in a faith courageous enough to embrace uncertainty. As we go out into our world today, may we co-create the ever-unfolding stories in ways we hope will bend the narrative toward justice, transformation, and love. May an enduring faith sustain us. May love continue to overcome. May hope abound. Blessed be. Amen.